I am, as I was before lunch, Jacques Delisle, the director of the Asia program here at FPRI. And I just wanted to welcome you all back. Thank you for being with us for, I think, was a truly stimulating session this morning, and more of the same to look forward to this afternoon. It's my honor in my role at this panel to introduce our post-lunch speaker, Aaron Friedberg, who is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, where he has been for quite some time now, probably 15 years or so. We're getting close to it. 20 plus, all right, well, good, time flies, right? 25 years almost. See, I'm just in denial about how late it's gotten on the calendar. He's director of Princeton, he was director of Princeton's research program in international security at the Wilson School, and director of the Center for International Studies. More recently, he's served as deputy assistant for national security affairs in the office of the vice president from 2003 to 2005, I believe. And was named to the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion in 2006. He's also a former fellow at the Smithsonian Institution's Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, where one of our speakers today, Gil Rosman, currently is, and a host of other positions at distinguished academic institutions here and abroad. He is the author of a forthcoming book that is quite germane to our topic today called Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia. Look for that in 2011. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon.com, probably even pre-ordered at this point. He is also the author of a number of other books and articles, including, given our discussion of American decline this morning, hopefully one that's not too relevant, The Weary Titan, 1895 to 1905, Britain and the Experience of Relative Decline. But you didn't come here to listen to me give Aaron Friedberg's bio. You rather came here to hear him speak. So without further ado, please welcome Aaron Friedberg.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a bit of a challenge to be the after-lunch speaker, so if anyone dozes off, I'll understand. I was asked to talk about the prospects for U.S. policy in Asia. So we've been talking about China, about Japan. We're going to talk about Taiwan and about Korea. I'm going to say a few words about the United States. And I want to focus in particular on U.S. policy towards and the U.S. relationship with China. And the reasons I think are obvious. This is, without doubt, the most important bilateral relationship in Asia, and I think arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the world. What happens between the United States and China is going to influence and to shape significantly everything else that happens in Asia, and again, I think arguably over time is going to have an impact on everything that happens elsewhere in the world. And to do this, I want to proceed in three steps. First, I'd like to talk about some of the most recent developments. But before I do that, I want to try to place them in a wider historic and strategic context. And then I'm going to close with a few words about what may lie ahead. So first, some context. The U.S.-China relationship today is mixed. This will come as no surprise. It has been for some time. Certainly since the end of the Cold War, this has been the case. The relationship contains elements of cooperation. The two countries cooperate in the economic domain. They trade extensively with one another. They have made efforts to find areas of convergent interest elsewhere in trying to solve some contentious regional and global issues. I would say most importantly, in one sense, they share what might be described as a negative interest, and that is their strong desire to avoid conflict with one another. And that's not a trivial factor. It's not always the case between great powers that there is that desire, and certainly that's true for the United States and China. So there are elements of cooperation, but there are also clearly elements of competition and rivalry. I'm going to say more about those in a minute. We can argue about what the mix is. Is it 50-50? Is it 70% competition, 30% cooperation? I don't know. But let me make two observations. First, it's my view that the competitive aspects of the relationship, the competitive dynamics, are very strong and they're deeply rooted. They are not, as I think they're sometimes described, the result of misperceptions or of readily correctable policy errors. It's not the case that if you've got just the right person in the right job or said the right things in just the right way, all problems between the two countries would evaporate. To the contrary, I believe that these competitive aspects of the relationship spring from two quite deep sources. One are the familiar dynamics of power politics. And anyone who's read Thucydides or knows anything about the history of international relations will recognize that circumstances in which there is a preponderant power that has held a dominant position for some period of time and a rapidly rising power that's closing the gap with that dominant power are situations in which there is an inherent tension. There is often an impulse towards competitive behavior, and sometimes, not infrequently historically, there has been a tendency for conflict between those powers. So the first thing that I would emphasize is the narrowing gap in power between the United States and China, with the United States still far and away dominant, but China rapidly rising, and that gap closing. The second factor I would emphasize is one that I think hasn't received sufficient attention or hasn't been viewed in what seems to me to be the appropriate way, and that is ideology. I mean, we often hear it said that China is no longer a communist country, therefore there is no ideological basis for a dispute between the United States and China. But I think to the contrary, there are deep and persistent divergences in ideology and also in the character of the institutions of the two countries. And to put it simply, I think it's the case that the United States, the American people, will never fully trust a regime that, in their view, suppresses freedom of religion, free speech, doesn't allow for democratic elections, and so on. That's a deeply rooted limit, I think, on the possibility of cooperative relations with China. And for their part, China's current leaders can never trust, whatever they may say, a liberal democratic power that they see as crusading and that they believe wants to see them ultimately displaced from power. And in that sense, one has to say that they're right. Regarding the cooperative elements or components of the relationship, in my view, we could talk about some of the details. I'll just touch on a few things lightly here. The cooperative part of the relationship between the United States and China is not as significant nor as substantial as is often claimed. And that some of the areas of supposed cooperation between the two countries are emerging now, in fact, as sources of friction. Economic interdependence is a source of potential cooperation. There are mutual gains to be had. Often it's the case that countries have extensive economic relationships, go to great lengths to avoid political conflict. But it is also true, as the United States discovered, for example, in its relationship with Japan in the 1980s, that very close economic relations can also be a source of friction. One could go through a number of areas where it's been argued that China and the United States have cooperated in pursuing common objectives. We heard a little bit about the six-party talks earlier. I think you can tell that as a story of a glass half full or half empty rather than half full. That in fact, if we look closely at Chinese policy and the extent to which China, in fact, pulled in the same direction as the United States, we see that China and the U.S. were actually working at cross purposes. And I believe that the same is going to appear to be true in the longer run as regards the efforts of the United States and other countries in the international community to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. I would say overall that if China's power continues to grow, as it seems to be likely to do, at least in the near term, but its regime doesn't change, if it continues to be ruled by a one-party authoritarian regime, then the competitive aspects of the relationship between the United States and China are going to grow, and the cooperative elements are going to shrink. They will not, in my view, most likely disappear, but they will become smaller and less significant even than they are today, and the competitive parts of the relationship will grow. So the relationship is mixed. I think it's mixed for some deep underlying reasons. The United States, over the last 15, 20 years, has evolved a mixed strategy to deal with this mixed relationship appropriately. The strategy is not the result of some comprehensive effort to sit back and review the character of the relationship between the United States and China and devise some unified, coherent, rational strategy. There's nothing resembling the kind of discussion that one found in the late 1940s and early 1950s about the nature of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, this policy has grown. It's organic. more than a mechanical construction. And it's grown really since the early 1990s. And I think in part, because it is organic and isn't written down, it's actually proved to be quite stable. It's persisted over time now across Republican and Democratic administrations, started really at the latter stages of the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush in the late 1980s and early 1990s, continued and was strengthened in certain respects under the Clinton administration. And despite some campaign rhetoric in 2000, it continued also under the George W. Bush administration, so for the preceding 8 years. And I would argue that it continues, albeit perhaps in slightly modified form, under the President Obama administration. I'm going to say a few words later about recent policy. This strategy, or this organic strategy, consists of two elements. And the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, wrote an article in 1999 in which he said, well, the policy of the United States should be described as congagement. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a much better diplomat than he was a phrasemaker. This never really caught on, but there is no better alternative, at least that I'm aware of. It really does capture the basic idea, or the two elements. The first part of this policy is engagement in all respects. Diplomacy, trade, the economic relationship that, as I've already mentioned, has been extremely important. And this engagement has had two goals. And American policymakers don't usually use these words. In fact, I would say they probably never use these words, but I think they're useful. The goals of the engagement part of U.S. policy are twofold. One, to tame China, to bring China into the international system, to make it, as it was referred to in the Bush administration, a responsible stakeholder, to draw it into international institutions, to give it a stake in preserving the stability of the existing international system, to discourage it from pursuing policies that might challenge that system, and in particular might challenge the interests of the United States. The second goal is to transform China, to encourage over time the liberalization of its domestic political institutions. And American political leaders have varied in the extent to which they're candid in saying this. Under the Clinton administration, it was not uncommon for U.S. officials to stand on podiums next to their Chinese counterparts and say, we're here, we're your friends, we want to encourage liberalization and your transformation into a liberal democracy. And they seemed somewhat surprised that their interlocutors didn't smile and perhaps didn't realize that the implications from their perspective was that they would be put out of a job. I think in recent years there's been some tendency to downplay this rhetoric, but nevertheless it remains. I think it's the fundamental objective of American policy in the long run. The hope has been through economic engagement that China will develop. As it develops economically, it will develop an expanding middle class, that in other parts of the world, certainly in Europe and in parts of Asia and South Korea and Taiwan, among other places, that process has led eventually to political liberalization. And so the hope has been that that would happen. And until I think fairly recently, many people believed that this was going to happen relatively soon, although I think a greater realism has set in more recently. The other part of the strategy is not really containment, although the Chinese view what the United States is doing as containment. I think a better word for it is balancing. And this part of U.S. strategy was somewhat slower to emerge and to be articulated. And I think if you track back into the 1990s, you find that it really begins after the 1995-96 Taiwan missile crisis, that it's after that event that U.S. officials, directors of Central Intelligence in particular, when they testify before Congress, begin to talk about China as a potential challenge to American interests and begin to track much more carefully the pattern and pace of China's ongoing military developments. In order to maintain a balance as China develops its capabilities and grows stronger, the United States has committed itself to doing three things. First, to maintaining its own military capabilities in Asia, and that again goes back to the mid-1990s when the Defense Department talked about there being a base of 100,000 men below which U.S. forces in the region wouldn't fall. And more recently, the United States has done rather more substantial things to maintain a balance. It's shifted, for example, the majority of its submarines from the Atlantic to the Pacific for the first time. It's put large numbers of aircraft on Guam, deployed B-2s and F-22s to Guam, and has taken a number of steps to maintain and strengthen its own military capabilities in Asia. So that's the first part. Secondly, and we've heard some discussion of this in the previous panel, the United States, since the mid-1990s, has made ongoing efforts to maintain and, indeed, where possible, to strengthen its existing bilateral alliance relationships. And that's certainly been a major theme of our dealings with Japan. That's been true with Korea as well, sometimes a bumpy road, but that's been the objective, with Australia, Thailand, and so on. So maintain and strengthen alliances that were created originally for a different purpose, but which now have, at least in part, as their prime goal, maintaining a balance of power in Asia as China grows stronger. The third part of the balancing half of American strategy has been an effort ongoing to build up what I would refer to as quasi-alliance relationships. So not signing treaties of mutual defense necessarily with other governments, but moving into much closer collaboration on a range of strategic issues with countries that share, to some degree, U.S. concerns about the rise of Chinese power. And this includes countries big and small. At one end of the spectrum, Singapore, beginning in 1990, inviting the U.S. To make use of facilities there. And at the high end of the spectrum, India, where the United States has moved quite a distance towards establishing a relationship which in many respects resembles a security alliance. And the goal of all of this, as I've said, has been to preserve a favorable balance of power even as China's power grows. So it's an ongoing project, and it requires more and more effort, presumably as China gets stronger. And the ultimate aim of this two-part strategy, the engagement part and the balancing part, I think one could summarize using a phrase that was used at the end of the Cold War to talk about American goals in Europe. And at that time, American officials said that their goal was a Europe whole and free. And I think, although, again, people haven't used this term as regards Asia, that is the ultimate goal of American strategy in Asia. Asia whole and free, an Asia made up of presumably democratic countries, ultimately unified, tied together by trade, political institutions, stable, and much less prone to war, as has been true in Europe. Let me turn now to saying something about the most recent developments. The Obama administration, as I indicated, has not made, and I don't think intended to make, any fundamental shift in this two-part strategy, this engagement strategy. But it did come into office, I think, intending to adjust the mix of elements between the two. And broadly speaking, I think the original intention was to increase the emphasis on the engagement part and to downplay, to some degree, the emphasis on balancing. And as regards increasing an emphasis on engagement, I think the administration believed at the beginning that it could broaden the scope of U.S. engagement with China. We're having trouble on economic issues. We can broaden the agenda to include environmental issues, climate change in particular. To deepen engagement, so to intensify ongoing dialogues between high-level officials, maybe even to flirt with the idea of something that might resemble a G2, although that idea never really took hold. There were people around the administration at the beginning who believed that that was a good idea. To downplay contentious issues for which there was no immediate resolution, and I would say that includes an interest, at least initially, in downplaying human rights. The Secretary of State, in her first visit to Beijing, made a point of saying, we're not going to let our differences over human rights get in the way of the important business of dealing with security issues and also managing the effects of the economic crisis. Last, again, this is something that I think was floated and may not fully have taken hold, was the idea that the goal of U.S. policy in dealing with China, at least the engagement piece, should be reassurance, that the United States and China both should go out of their way to reassure one another about their intentions, that was important in order to move forward and improve relations beyond what had been achieved thus far. So an increased emphasis on engagement. I don't think the administration ever intended or thought that it could do away with the hedging or balancing piece of the equation, although there were people around the administration in its early days who criticized the previous administration for making too much of the hedging or balancing piece, and who argued that by doing that, the United States was perhaps unintentionally stimulating China to do things that it might not otherwise have done. So perhaps to back away from talk about the necessity of maintaining U.S. military capabilities in the region. I don't think this was a substantial, there was never an intent to reduce in any substantial way U.S. military power, but to talk about it a little bit less. And some of the decisions that were made early on, not to sell F-22s to Japan, the sense that I think some people had, at least initially, that the new administration was not as enthusiastic about its relationship with India, statements made by the former and then current Secretary of Defense Gates about the importance of emphasizing fighting the wars we're in and not talking so much about future warfare, which obviously meant not talking so much about China. The last 2 years have seen a series of setbacks. Chinese behavior across a range of issues has been increasingly assertive and arguably even aggressive. At the regional level, and again, we've heard about a number of these things. I'm just going to quickly tick them off. A refusal not only to apply sufficient pressure to North Korea to have any possibility of persuading them to give up their nuclear programs, but even to hold them to account for an obvious act of war and the killing of South Korean sailors. Renewed tensions with the United States, a kind of recurrent story about arms sales to Taiwan, impeccable incident, vocal objections to U.S. ROK exercises, which were in fact intended to be directed at North Korea, but which China took as in part being directed at itself. The declaration that the South China Sea represented a core interest of China, the confrontation with Japan that's been referred to earlier. So a lot of issues in the region. At a global level, it quickly became apparent that the idea that climate change could be an area in which the United States and China would cooperate was entirely wrong, and that in fact that would emerge, as it has, as a new area of contention between the two powers. In the economic domain, continuation and I think an escalation of tension on a number of issues, very limited movement on the part of the Chinese government regarding currency valuation, despite increasing pressure from the United States to do something about that. And then most recently, this rare earth mineral embargo, if that's in fact what it is, directed at a number of countries in the region and at least indirectly, potentially, at the United States. In the military domain, China has continued its rapid military buildup and this maturing complex of so-called anti-access or area denial capabilities. It has not in any measurable way increased transparency in discussing its plans, force plans, budgets, and so on. And it's moving towards, or many people believe it's moving towards testing a number of new capabilities which would potentially change the balance of power in the region, in particular anti-ship ballistic missile, which may be tested in the relatively near term. Finally, just as a matter of tone, depending on how you look at it, the way in which China has interacted with not just the United States, but countries in the region and countries in Europe as well in the last several years has been perceived as being, I suppose the polite way might be to say it might be, to use the word, uncompromising. It could also be interpreted as being arrogant and high-handed, and certainly that's something you hear from European counterparts now about the treatment that they feel they've received from Chinese diplomats. So the question facing American policymakers now is, first of all, what explains these recent shifts in Chinese behavior? And I think there are three explanations on offer. The first, which is, I think, one one heard this a little bit more a year or so ago, a little bit less now, was the possibility that somehow these were random developments or uncoordinated developments, that they were statements on one issue or another by sort of rogue generals or hardliners. But it seems to me that that has become less plausible with the passage of time, because we see this general tendency repeated across a wide range of areas. The second possible explanation, and I wouldn't rule this out, is that in some way this is linked to Chinese domestic politics, and in particular the impending leadership transition, and also perhaps a residual concern on the part of the leadership about internal stability in the wake of the global financial crisis. China's leaders know they've done reasonably well in skating past the big pothole that the advanced industrial economies ran into, but they're worried, presumably, that they haven't escaped this altogether, and perhaps one of the things they're doing is stirring up nationalist sentiment in part to deflect what might otherwise be popular resentment that would be directed at the regime. It seems to me that there is probably something to this idea that some of what's going on in China is influencing China's external behavior. But although I've heard it put forward as a reassuring observation, in fact, it seems to me it's exactly the opposite. That if what we know from this is that the winning position in China's elite domestic politics is to take the hardest possible line towards the United States, Japan, the West, that, it seems to me, is not at all reassuring. The third explanation, which is the one that I would tend towards, is that this shift in policy across a range of areas reflects a shift in Chinese assessments of the underlying configuration of forces. There's an increasing confidence regarding China's prospects, especially given its apparent success in managing the recent economic crisis. And I agree, some said earlier, that this is mixed with a kind of anxiety or insecurity. I think that's absolutely right, but there is no denying the confident tone from many Chinese observers and Chinese officials. And in addition, and this may be even more important, the perception of American decline. I think you can date this to 2006. Maybe it goes back a little bit earlier. But at the very depth of America's difficulties in Iraq, when other people in other parts of the world, including in Europe and some in the United States, were beginning to talk about American decline, the end of the unipolar era, and so on, Chinese observers, too, tend to be somewhat cautious in saying these things, began to make similar observations. And this tendency, which began then, was certainly strengthened by the economic crisis, 2007, 8, 9, in the sense that the United States was in the midst of what would likely prove to be prolonged economic difficulties. And it may also be the case that there was some inclination, at least initially, on the part of Chinese leaders to misread the intentions and the resolve of the new U.S. administration. The overall view seems to be that the era of unipolarity, which China has had to accept, is drawing to a close, and that the long-predicted era of multipolarity, predicted by Deng Xiaoping at the latter stages of the Cold War, and then deferred after the collapse of the Soviet Union by the evident emergence of the United States as the dominant global power, this long-predicted era of multipolarity may finally be at hand. And if you look carefully in the writings of at least some Chinese authors, you see, I think, the suggestion that what's coming is not an era of multipolarity, in fact, but an era of bipolarity. And China will emerge as the other major power alongside the United States. And there's a lot of caution about saying that because people don't want to appear provocative. They also don't want to appear to be doubting the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping and the idea of multipolarity, but nevertheless, it's there. The changing balance of power, or the perceived changes in the balance of power, may give China new opportunities to push towards its objectives in Asia. And I would say, although I can't prove this in any way, that those objectives broadly involve reducing America's power, influence, and presence in the region, which from the Chinese perspective is a kind of artificial construct that's the result largely of the aftermath of the Second World War, while at the same time increasing China's, and eventually over time putting China in the position where it is clearly the preponderant power in the region, where instead the United States is today. Just a word here, this is not my topic, but I can't resist saying something about it, about Chinese strategy, or about what appears to me to be the Chinese strategy. Interestingly, I think the Chinese, too, have been quite consistent. I would say both the United States and China have pursued broadly consistent policies or strategies towards one another. In the Chinese case, in fact, this was, I think, the result of more deliberate calculation and planning. The strategy really emerged in the early 1990s and has been followed since. And I would say that it has three elements to it. The first, and maybe the most important, is avoid confrontation. China has gone to great lengths to avoid confrontation with the United States and with other major powers. It recognizes the need to maintain a stable international environment, in part so that it can undertake the second part of its strategy, which is building up what Chinese observers refer to as their comprehensive national power. So economic power, military power, political influence, and now the Chinese seem to have been infected with a concept from American political science, and they talk about soft power. So they'll spend a few years trying to figure out what that is and how to measure it, but build up all aspects of American or Chinese comprehensive national power. And the third element, I think, of this strategy has been to advance incrementally. I don't think the Chinese have some grand master plan that they feel they can implement over a set period of time, but rather they have a general sense of the direction in which they want to go, and when opportunities present themselves, they will take actions that are designed to move them further in that direction. The question, I think, now is whether this strategy, which is quite cautious and incremental, may be changing in some fundamental way. And if you look, there are debates, there have been discussions among Chinese academics and strategic thinkers about whether Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy that was referred to earlier, importance of hiding our capabilities and biding our time, has now outlived its usefulness, whether China should emerge and behave in some more assertive way. I think that's an open question. The Obama administration's response to these tendencies in Chinese behavior, it seems to me, has been entirely appropriate. It has not backed away from engagement, but rather it has undertaken an increased focus on the balancing part of American strategy. So it's held to this broad consensus policy, but instead of increasing the emphasis on engagement as it did originally, it is now increasing the emphasis on the balancing part of the equation. And there are many recent indications of this. Secretary Clinton's statements regarding the South China Sea and the importance of U.S. interests there and the U.S. willingness to become involved there. The President's upcoming visit to the region, which begins next week, which will have as its focus a very conspicuous agenda of meeting with the leaders of the democratic countries in Asia and not going to China. And there are other smaller elements, I think, of this as well, a willingness to deal more directly and more closely with Vietnam that's become evident in the last few months, enhanced military cooperation with South Korea, growing out of the ship sinking incident, but I think with perhaps a broader agenda yet to come. The United States government, in short, is trying to take advantage of what might be described as natural balancing tendencies in the region. As the countries of the region become more fearful and more concerned about the rise of Chinese power, they will look to the United States. They are looking to the United States to help them maintain a balance. They're willing to do more now than I think they were a year or 2 years ago. And where we are now is the United States is considering the various ways in which it may be able to take advantage of that impulse. Say a few words about what may come next. If past performance is any indication, Beijing will probably try to walk back the cat or put the toothpaste back in the tube. I don't know what the appropriate term would be. There are clear signs that at least some people in the Chinese system recognize that they've overreached and that they've now succeeded in provoking exactly the kinds of responses that they don't want. But I would say that if, in fact, this is what happens, as it has in the past when similar things have occurred, the changes will have much more to do with tactics and with timing than with strategy or with long-term objectives. And if you look, for example, at the discussion that's bubbled out around the edges about whether it was wise to indicate that the South China Sea had now become a core interest of the United States, it doesn't seem to me that you see people saying, no, this is a stupid thing. We shouldn't think of our interest in this way, but rather people saying it was foolish for us to say this or foolish for us to say it now. Not the idea, the objective is wrong, but perhaps we didn't handle it as best we could. And in fact, we provoked these reactions which were unnecessary, and now we have to back up a little bit, and then we can move forward. The U.S. administration will no doubt be very eager to reduce tensions and to achieve at least some superficial improvement in relations. And mention was made of the desire of both parties, I think, to have successful summit meetings and so on. And certainly the U.S. is eager to put things right and to improve the climate of relations. This is all fine, but it doesn't seem to me that it's going to change the underlying dynamics of the situation, which, in my view, still point strongly towards increased competition. Moreover, there are some risks. First, the Chinese may not pull back, as they have in the past. They may continue to underestimate the resolve of the United States and its allies. They could continue to push on a number of issues, as they've continued to push Japan, for example, and that could lead to rapidly deteriorating relations. Again, even if that's not what they intend, if they miscalculate, they could wind up in a situation that could be dangerous to all concerned. I indicated there seem to be indications that some people in the Chinese system recognize that what they've been doing recently is counterproductive, but there seem to be others as well who aren't getting the message. And as a result, it's at least conceivable that China as a whole may not respond appropriately to this stimulus that now seems clearly to be applied by the outside world. So that's number one. They may not pull back. Number two, the second risk is that domestic political processes on both sides could encourage a process of escalation. This tendency to invoke or to play on hyper-nationalist sentiments in China, which we've seen before, is a strong one, but it can also be a dangerous one for the leadership. It's something that they don't always have the capacity fully to control once it's been unleashed. There are some indications that the balance of power internally between the military and civilian authorities is shifting, and that the military may be becoming more influential than the civilians. And some combination of these factors could tend to override the cautious strategic reflexes that might otherwise be there. Again, I don't think this would necessarily mean a shift in goals, but it could mean that China continues to push forward for reasons that are not essentially strategic, but have to do with domestic political processes. And in the United States, too, a prolonged period of slow economic growth and high unemployment, which seems to be what we're in for, is leading already to pressures for protectionism. It has also manifested itself in quite a surprising way in anti-Chinese sentiment, as evidenced in political commercials in the recent campaign. It seems to me that concern about China as a strategic competitor is, in fact, a good thing, but it needs to be channeled in the right directions, which are not imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, but rather taking steps to strengthen the U.S. position in the region. So that's the second set of risks. Domestic political processes on both sides could encourage escalation. There is a third, which, in my view, is a substantial risk as well, and that's a danger of what might be called underbalancing. Balance of power doesn't balance automatically. People have to do the right things in order for it to be maintained. The United States and its allies, separately and together, may not do enough to maintain a suitable balance of hard power. Doing this is not just a matter of making speeches, state visits, diplomacy, and so on. It requires, among other things, that the United States and its allies, too, expend significant resources to develop the kinds of military capabilities that are going to be needed to counter China's growing, particularly its anti-access capabilities in order to maintain deterrence and keep the peace. In addition, it's going to require moving towards closer strategic cooperation between the United States and its key allies, and I would say also, and again, this is something that was touched on earlier, among the United States and its key allies. So U.S., Japan, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, there are various combinations, and they're going to have to work together, I think, fairly closely as time goes on, as China's power increases, in order to maintain a favorable balance. But the things that I've just mentioned are costly, they're going to be politically controversial, and they'll be diplomatically difficult. China will, as it has in the past, and sometimes quite successfully, try very hard to discourage the United States, to discourage its allies from doing any of the things that I just mentioned, arguing that these are destabilizing measures. The United States, as well, may lack the resources and may lack the resolve to do the kinds of things that I would argue we need to do, partly because we're in very difficult economic straits, and we're not going to have a lot of spare cash rattling around for the next 10 years or more with which to undertake some substantial increase in our military capabilities in Asia. If the United States doesn't do these things, however, it seems to me that others in the region are not likely to do so. In fact, I think the general tendency is for others in the region, when they become concerned about China, to look to the east to see what the United States is going to do and to calibrate their own policies accordingly. And if they see the United States willing and able to step up and play an increased role, they will be willing to do the same thing. But if they see the United States not taking the threat seriously or not having the resources or the resolve to respond, they are going to have to make their own choices about what's best for them. And that could lead to a further erosion in the balance of power, thereby encouraging even more assertive policies on the part of China and increasing the risks of dangerous miscalculation, confrontation, and even conflict. Thank you. I think the
There's time for questions.
Time for questions. Okay. Admiral.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Aaron, I have a couple of subtle points. I hope maybe you'll discern them anyway. As to the way that the two countries view each other, I thought that it was important to note that the Chinese Communist Party, in my view, believes it's justifiably and beneficially in power, and even that it has some democratic features to it, and that the U.S. should understand that, at least comprehend it, tolerate it anyway. I think many Americans believe that the Chinese people want democracy, yet, of course, we don't see that most of the Chinese we talk to are advocating overthrow of their government, although there are some, but that's not a pervasive factor. You talked about, speaking of reassurance in our engagement. It seems to me that it's more appropriate for us to be discussing candor. What I mean is that we tell each other, yes, indeed, we have to hedge, but also we have to get along. That we disagree on Taiwan, we disagree on their form of government, but we move on and put those things behind us somehow. With respect to Deng Xiaoping's 28 characters, I wish I'm going to memorize this one of these days, but I keep forgetting. I think it ends with something about doing something good or accomplishing something.
Right.
So it doesn't end just with we hide our abilities and we'll get them later. It just doesn't end that way.
I don't think it says do something good. It says do something.
Do something.
Get something.
Now I can be accused of misinterpreting. With respect to increased competition, I agree with you that healthy competition. For example, I guess it was yesterday's Post or something that talked about windmills and so forth. Cheap windmills built in China and doing the R&D here is just fine. I think it's called competitive advantage.
Well, thank you. There is no doubt that the CCP believes that it's legitimate and has a right to rule. In fact, I think if you had to sum up the essence of its policy, both domestically and externally. It's to make the world safe for continued CCP rule. That doesn't mean that we have to accept that as a desirable objective. Americans believe that Chinese people want democracy. Yes, I think probably most Americans do believe that. I don't think we have the evidence one way or another because it's not a democratic country, so we're not going to find out until that's the case. We do know that there's some very brave people who have been willing to put their lives on the line to write documents which by our standards are utterly innocuous, which don't even attack the party, but simply call for open political debate, multi-party competition, free press, and so on. And the response of the regime to those people, I think, reveals the true character of the regime. It can't tolerate even that level of challenge. Candor, I agree completely. I would actually turn it around, though. I think we've allowed ourselves to be conditioned to an unhealthy degree by China's responses to things that we do and that we encourage our allies to do, which I believe are essential for our own national security interests. The Chinese aren't going to like a lot of the things that I think we need to do. They didn't like the idea that we had an initial quadrilateral discussion involving the United States, Japan, Korea, and Australia. And we pulled the rug out from under that. Absolutely no good reason to do that. We ought to be able to say to the Chinese government when there's a complaint, we understand your concerns, we're not out to get you, but we have our own national security interests, and we and our allies, happen to be these other democratic countries, are going to talk and cooperate and deal with one another as we see necessary. When the Chinese object, as they no doubt will, to measures that the United States might take, for example, to reduce the vulnerability of our forces in the region from ballistic missile attack, the response in part can be, if you don't like that response, don't build hundreds of new ballistic missiles every year. You are scaring everybody, and this is the response that you're going to get. So I think we have to be candid with ourselves and also with the Chinese. They're not going to run screaming from the room, shocked to discover that these are things that we're going to do. They know full well that we have an interest in this. But they've also learned that if they behave in an appropriate or inappropriately demonstrative, emotional way, sometimes they can influence the policies of democratic countries. So I think we have to reach a new level of maturity, which will allow us to say, we're going to engage, we want to trade, we want to talk, we want to resolve differences where we can, but we also need to do what we need to do to maintain our security, and we're going to do those things. Increasing competition, yes, no, absolutely. There's everything to be gained from real economic competition between the United States and China, or China and other countries, but we're also involved in a military competition. And the Chinese have seen themselves involved in military competition with us since the end of the Cold War, if not before. It's taken us quite a long time, I think, to get around to recognizing that, in fact, we are engaged in a military competition with them, and that it's quite a serious one. And that contrary to what I think many people were assuming 10 years ago, the Chinese are not going to simply sort of slavishly follow the model that we set and lag along 10 and 20 years behind us so that we'll always be ahead. They've, in fact, I think quite smartly, begun to develop some so-called asymmetric capabilities, which may give them some real operational advantages, and to which we have to find some response. We've spent billions of dollars on aircraft carriers, which could turn out to be gigantic targets. The Chinese are spending a lot less on developing conventional ballistic missiles, which may at some point be able to hold those carriers at risk, force them to operate at great distance from China's shores, reduce our ability to project power into the region. So I think I hope we're starting to get more serious about this, but it's taken quite a while. And just one other thing, this is maybe a detail, but it's not as if there are people lurking in the halls of the Pentagon who are eager to have a military rivalry with China. I find my academic colleagues sometimes don't believe me when I tell them this, but I said, you find the person who wants to, they're way down in the weeds. Nobody really wants to do this, and for all kinds of reasons. One of the reasons, though, is perhaps not not really a good one, and that is that taking this seriously is going to require the military services in this country, particularly the Navy and the Air Force, to do a bunch of things that they don't want to do. It may require them to diminish their reliance on aircraft carriers when the top people in the Navy have made their careers by commanding carrier battle groups. It may mean that relatively short-range fighter aircraft, on which we've spent billions and billions of dollars and our wonders of engineering, are useless in that theater because the ranges are so long and the number of bases that are available is so small. So we're probably going to have to think differently about how we configure our forces, and there's a lot of bureaucratic resistance to that as well as all the other concerns. Yes, ma'am.
Can you come to the microphone?
Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times, Taiwan. I just wonder, in this new, change of a dynamic, does Taiwan still relevant or, strategically valued to the U.S.? Because we haven't heard much talk in this regard. Thanks.
Yeah. I think there was a tendency, and Professor Rosman referred to this obliquely. I think there has been a tendency since the KMT came back into power for some people in the United States to sort of assume that this problem is solved. And somehow the KMT government and the mainland will work out some modus vivendi and will take this problem off the table, and it will no longer be a source of contention between the United States and China. I don't think that's actually what's going to happen, in part because Taiwan is a democratic country and some large percentage of the people on that island don't want to be reintegrated with China, at least not under its current leadership. We don't know who's going to win the next presidential election in Taiwan because Taiwan's a democracy. So that issue, I think, has not, in fact, gone away. It seems to me that the United States has a strong interest in adhering to the policies that it has set out in recent decades of not favoring or opposing a forcible resolution of the Taiwan issue and insisting that whatever agreements are worked out are mutually satisfactory to both sides. Two other things which relate more to the previous discussion about strategy. For a long time, there was a tendency, I think, in the United States and maybe in the region to believe that everything that China was doing militarily was directed at Taiwan. And it's slowly, I think, begun to dawn on people that that's not the case, that although China has developed significant capabilities that are intended for that purpose, if Taiwan disappeared tomorrow, China would continue to, for example, to develop its naval capabilities, ballistic missiles, and so on. It has much bigger fish to fry than Taiwan, and we're now beginning to realize that. The last thing I would say is that from a strategic perspective, for China to be reintegrated with the mainland and used by the mainland as a facility for military operations would complicate to a considerable degree the strategic challenges that the United States and its allies face in trying to maintain freedom of navigation through the Western Pacific. And that's a concern for our friends and allies in Japan. I think it's beginning to be a little bit for people in South Korea as well. So that's another reason, I think, for not wanting this problem to be solved, certainly not to be solved forcibly, and not to be solved in a way that would allow the current CCP regime to make use of Taiwan for strategic purposes. Yes, sir.
Vincent Wang, University of Richmond. It is hard to imagine that the Chinese deliberately made those comments or did those things to provoke the kind of counterbalancing you were talking about. Let's suppose, entertain thought for a moment that perhaps they wish those generals have not said those things and so on. So one of the possibilities you mentioned is that the Chinese may not pull back. But let's suppose the Chinese decide to pull back. I think there's actually an early episode in the third generation of Chinese leadership. Jiang Zemin was very much wanted the world to recognize China's new role, and then they replace it with a reassurance policy, good neighbor policy, free trade agreements, this vibrant Chinese economic development seen as an opportunity by a lot of Southeast Asian countries. So a lot of countries saw that as an opportunity, even though the Chinese continue building military installations in the South China Sea. So the fundamental has not changed. So if China were to pull back this time and try to reassure the world again, what can they do this time?
What could China do, or
what can China do, and
Yeah.
will they get the same kind of mileage they did last time?
It's a very good question. I think we're going to see that put to the test because, as I said, if I had to bet, I would say that's what they'll try to do. I don't think that they're foolish or blind or looking at this point for any kind of confrontation, and they may have been surprised or taken aback by the extent to which they provoked these responses. I think it is going to be harder for them, though, to walk back to the position that they had before. When they did this in the 1990s, for example, on the South China Sea issues, initially taking a very assertive stance, then recognizing that it was counterproductive, pulling back and saying that they would deal with things in a multilateral setting, they didn't really have the capabilities to do anything else. They were still at a very early stage in their military development. I think it's harder to persuade people that you're not a problem when you have these kind of physical manifestations of military power, which are now undeniable. And it seems to me that the future direction of Chinese military development over the next decade or so is going to be towards the acquisition of more power projection capabilities, the development of this massive submarine base on Hainan Island, all of which is going to be pointing directly out into the South China Sea and to the south. It's going to be hard to make that go away. So I think the underlying anxiety is going to remain. I think the objective of Chinese policy would be, as I think it has been in the past, to try to calm people down, to try to dull the competitive reflexes and slow down whatever the United States and other countries in the region might do to try to counteract China's military developments. I think they want to play this out until they're in a stronger position. And they may be able to do that in part, but I don't see it seems to be very unlikely that they would take sort of concrete measures that would suggest they were reducing their military capabilities or they were reducing the pace at which they were developing those capabilities. And absent that, I think the climate has changed sufficiently so that it's not going to be easy for them to go back to the situation they were in before. One little piece of evidence of this, and it's maybe not characteristic of all the countries in the region, but the Australian Defence White Paper of, I guess it was last year, which is really remarkably candid in saying we have concerns over the development of Chinese military capabilities and we have concerns over the staying power of the United States. So we are going to do things that we think we need to do to work more closely with the U.S., but also to take care of our interests, even if the United States is preoccupied elsewhere. And that's under a government that many people thought was somehow going to be more favorably disposed towards China. And I think similar thinking is going on in other places. I know that it is in India, for example, Vietnam probably as well. So I think we're in a new phase. It's not going to stay as tense as it may appear to be now, but it's not going to go back to what it was before.
We have a question from the web from Don Emerson, Stanford University. Is a Beijing consensus developing, and if so, with what content and implications?
Well, thank you, Professor Emerson. I'm an admirer of your work, even though you're not here. I think the idea of the Beijing consensus, which is this notion that you could combine essentially authoritarian politics with market economics, it was a Western invention originally. The Chinese didn't go around talking about the Beijing consensus. A number of Western observers talked about it. And at least initially, I think there was a real reluctance on the part of people in China to take this seriously and to be in a position where they were seen to be pushing anything because they don't want to be perceived as ideological. They don't want to be pushing any particular agenda. They have their interests. But I think that has started to change somewhat. And you do find people in Chinese or strategic circles saying, first, we're becoming a global power willy-nilly. It's not perhaps what we had thought, or it's happened more quickly than we expected, but here we are on the world stage interacting all over the place. It's not just in Asia. And we have to stand for something. When they look at the United States, they say, well, it's not just America's material power. The United States is perceived to stand for something. It may not be something we like, but we need to stand for something too. And what is it that we're going to stand for? Well, we can set up Confucius Institutes and so on, but there's a limit to how far that travels. But perhaps what we have to offer is either this alternative view of how exactly to conduct economic and political development, and at the very least, what we have to offer is potentially support, material support, for leaders who are under pressure from the United States and under pressure from the West because of the way in which they repress their own populations or other reasons. So I think China's engagement increasingly with a number of countries around the world that from the U.S. perspective and the perspective of others, including in Europe, these countries are bad actors, is in part because they're interested in resources. That's why they're in Venezuela. That's why they're dealing with Iran and so on. But I do think it has this other component to it. And it's in part, I think, a desire not to be the last authoritarian regime on the planet. That's not a very comfortable position to be in. So if there are other people out there who you can support and maybe give the United States headaches and keep it preoccupied, why not? But that's not the same as having an ideology of something in which you really believe that you're trying to spread around the world. I don't think they have that.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.